Well, welcome to Core 40 last day. You all have been persistent in finishing everything. Good deal. And hopefully, we can have a good start to our morning here. All right. Everybody see the world and the title?
Yep, looks great.
Good deal. Okay. Today we are going to try to focus in on how human trafficking 101 applies to victim advocates. So, if some of you have had 101 training, this will be a bit of a review, but the latter half of the presentation, I really want to make it more specific and relevant for you all. I am at home right now in my home office. So, if you hear a little bit of background noise, that's just my family outside. I do have a noise machine on to try and minimize that. All right, so this is me. I am a licensed mental health counselor here in Indiana. My professional experience includes working with survivors of trauma, folks with substance use, folks in the LGBTQIA community, and systems involved youth and families. Right now, I didn't put this on the slide because I work for a hospital system and they typically like to, approve everything. But I do work at Eskenazi Health in a serious mental illness clinic. So that's where I am now. I have a little over 2 years in the anti-trafficking field, and I had the pleasure to work at IKESA when they had their human trafficking program. So if you heard about the anti-trafficking team formerly, I was part of that and got my master's at Ball State. Really, what I do is and why I do it, I want to collaborate with other providers and make sure that we have that disciplinary response to human trafficking. Being where I am now, a lot of our folks, because they have serious mental illness, they're quite vulnerable to many forms of exploitation. And so, having the background that I do, I'm always very aware of that and want to make sure that my staff know about resources. Still bring in the work with me, just in a different context. Okay, so today, as I said, we'll do some human trafficking 101, but then I really want to highlight what are the differences and similarities between human trafficking? I'll probably use HT as an abbreviation throughout the presentation. So, what are the differences and similarities with domestic violence and sexual violence? We're going to recognize some signs of human trafficking and then again make it really honed in for you all, best practices for responding, and then what are some local and state resources for HT survivors. I can see the chat and also the screen because I have dual monitors. So at any time, feel free to use the raise your hand feature or put it in the chat. Yes, excited to engage. That's what I love about being here. So if we need to, pause from the slides and have a conversation, that's awesome. That's learning too. So yeah, I'd love to hear from you all. Okay. So if you could start putting these in the chat, what images or words come to mind when you think of a human trafficking survivor? Also, thanks, Semi. I'm excited to be here. So yeah, do we have any ideas about who would be a survivor? Any words that we would associate with someone who is a survivor? Okay, yeah, slavery. So thinking about human trafficking as a form of slavery. Yeah. Anyone can be a survivor. Absolutely. Yes. That's really important to highlight because while we have vulnerable populations who can be more susceptible, it really could be anyone. Yeah, definitely children. Again, without that prevention education, kids may not know really what's happening. Yeah. Ooh, people with barriers. I really like that because it's not just a vulnerability that's a problem or creates exploitation. It's the fact that if people can't access care or help. Yeah, 100%. Feeling trapped. Yeah, thank you so much. Those are all really great. So, this is the federal law. I will not fully read this to you because I break it down on the next slide. But this is just to show that the federal government has recognized human trafficking in those terms since the year 2000 and has continued to renew it. Formerly, there were laws on involuntary servitude, debt bondage, and the human trafficking law at the federal level now just tries to kind of lump all that together to explain this crime. So for sex trafficking, they break it down into sex trafficking and labor trafficking. For the sex trafficking statute specifically, it's important to know that if there's anyone under the age of 18 involved in commercial sex of any kind, then they are considered a survivor, which is helpful because that means that they are not meant to be charged for any kind of commercial sex. They're not going to be, they're not going to have a crime on their record for that, ideally, right? So Commercial sex, if you're not familiar, that is the exchange of sex for anything of value. So that can be money, but it can also be drugs, medication, groceries. So anything of value. And in entering into a sex act in exchange for that would count as commercial sex. For adults and in sex trafficking and labor trafficking, there has to be these elements of force, fraud, and coercion. So here, the National Human Trafficking Resource Center put together this model. And so we start with the action. When we think about this crime, what is the person who is trafficking or the trafficker? What are they doing? So, some examples that are relevant to Indiana that I saw, one is recruiting. So, there's a person who says, hey, this is going to be a great job for you. You're going to make a lot of money. Um, and I'm having a great experience, talking it up. Or this is a great job. It's going to be, really a good setup for you. I know, you just got to the country or you've, been dealing with poverty. So, like, come on, let's do this. And that would be an example of fraud. So, we'll get to that in a minute. Providing and obtaining also definitely relevant, if you think about like the traditional brothel, that would be an example here. If like there's a business owner who understands what is happening in their establishment, that could be considered trafficking as well. The means of force, fraud, and coercion, I really want to give a lot of examples of this. So that's what I cover in the next slide. But briefly, force, would be any kind of physical force, any type of like either, restraining or physical violence. Fraud is lying about what the work will actually entail. So saying it's going to be great. And then, in fact, there's no money involved. There's a lot of violence, that kind of thing. And then coercion can be very cultural. We've noticed a lot of culturally specific manipulation. So, if you don't do this, I will, report you to ICE. Or if you don't do this, I will harm your children, that kind of thing. So, really, the unfortunate thing of, the trafficker has this mindset of, well, I'm making money off of this person. I'm going to do whatever it takes. Right. And then there's currently two forms of trafficking recognized: labor trafficking, so that's any form of work, and then commercial sex, as I mentioned. So these are some examples of means. So, how does trafficking happen? What needs to be involved for this crime to be considered trafficking? So, here's some examples of force. Force can include sexual violence, but it can also include like initiation into a community, right? Like you have to do this in order to be accepted. If you think about like cult practices, that's kind of an extreme example of initiation. For fraud, not only would it be like the false promise of what the job is or lying about the working conditions, but a lot of it can involve the money, right? This crime is about money. And so withholding those wages that were advertised could be considered trafficking. And then with coercion, again, that, climate of fear, emotional abuse can also be after that control has been established, usually through force, can be like threats of additional harm or forms of humiliation. Okay. Any questions or thoughts at this point about how this crime is defined? So here's where we give some really specific examples and bust some myths. So human trafficking is not human smuggling. Those are different crimes. Worldwide, there will still be those news reports about like 30 people were trafficked across a border. So more of a legal definition, but it is important to understand that smuggling is a crime against a country. So, people aren't legally in the country. They've been brought from one country to another. That's smuggling. Trafficking involves that force, fraud, and coercion. So, something that folks do not consent to. Kidnapping is not common at all. It does happen. Certainly, that is a way that folks are trafficked. But the most recent data that we have from Polaris, who runs the National Human Trafficking Hotline, it was that 83% of calls established a pre-existing relationship between the survivor and the trafficker. So some of them were employers, family members, or intimate partners. That's a pretty large majority that unfortunately the people closest to us, they have the most information. So if they have ill intent, that can create that environment. A lot of examples on social media, especially during the pandemic. We all were on lockdown. I think some folks just got really in their heads about things and maybe we were a little bored. And so a lot of these stories just started circulating about like kids being shipped in Wayfair cabinets, car tagging to initiate a kidnapping scheme. Everything that was investigated just didn't turn up as true. That probably just involves like different crimes. There were no children in cabinets. The FBI investigated that. If it sounds outlandish, it probably is. And then the word rescue, while I think it has good intentions, especially with children, right? Like um, kids who are really vulnerable, that language can often be dehumanizing. A lot of survivors have come forward and say, like, didn't want to be rescued. Like, I'm not a damsel in distress. This was a very hard time in my life. And they may not even identify as a victim, right? So if they're not a victim, they don't really need rescuing, right? So those are just some examples of things that have kind of come up, things that I heard when I first started in this work. So just kind of want to level set and make sure that we all have that same understanding. Okay, so here's why I give the really specific examples. And as I'm giving these examples, I really want you to think about like, are there any clients I've worked with where this seems like it might have happened? You can put, yeah, I recognize that in the chat, or no, like I've never really seen any of this. But just be thinking about that. And if you want to participate in the chat, saying if you connect with one of these examples, then yeah, feel free to do that. So familial trafficking is, when a family member is the trafficker. This can often be an intergenerational problem. So a survivor that I had worked with on a project while I was at ICASA, she stated that while she was a teenager, like this was just an expectation that she engage in commercial sex because they needed to pay rent. And it was something that her mom had done. Right. And so while it can be pretty shocking to hear like a family member was sort of running this operation, if you will, like oftentimes they've experienced that same exploitation. So it changes their perspective on what's okay. So that is one example. And often it kind of existing with the drug facilitated trafficking. And so folks that already have a substance use problem or a disorder, they may be so desperate and so sick that they're willing to have their family member, or they feel desperate enough that they, engage in commercial sex or work for no pay because they just really are sick and dependent on that substance. So those often coincide. There was a case recently that I heard about when I was in Wisconsin giving another presentation that, someone had trafficked their child um, for substances. And it's just devastating, right? But it's important to not bring shame and stigma to that and just to understand there are other reasons, valid reasons to that person that led them. An intimate partner, the person seems like a knight in shining armor, or just a wonderful partner, and then, says, okay, we need to make rent. Or if you love me, you're going to go out and do this. You're going to work in my restaurant for 16 hours and with no pay and, clean everything spotless, or, I'll hurt you. Right. Like that could be an example of that. And really creating that trust, right? Like you loved this person. There was a really good bond, and then the tables turn, right? Similar to DV. And then a lot of law enforcement involved trafficking cases involve like spa and what they call illicit massage parlors. So typically these are foreign born women, often Chinese, and they come to work in spas, are told it's going to be a wonderful job, and they're going to make this much money. And then as soon as they get here, the owner of the business says, well, it took 30 grand to get you here. So you have to work off that debt. I can't pay you until that debt is there. And then they just keep adding on different reasons why, folks can't make money. And it often involves erotic massage or commercial sex acts. So these are some examples of sex trafficking, and several of those are specific to Indiana and are things that we've seen here. Any questions or thoughts on any of those? All right. So, some examples of labor trafficking. Domestic work can be pretty common because if someone's working in your home and living in your home, it's pretty easy to engage in a bad behavior without anyone noticing, right? So, yeah, this could be a nanny, a private household worker. If anyone heard of the case with Neil Gaiman last year. He's written some of my favorite TV shows, favorite books, and unfortunately, he was trafficking his nanny. So, it's something that I'm glad that there's being more attention brought to this and that the charges are actually being brought because oftentimes, folks that have a lot of money and power, charges don't land. So, yeah, that is an example of that. Agricultural workers and construction workers, this is a great place to focus your advocacy right now because a lot of these situations involve folks here on work visas. And so, with the increase of ICE involvement and the changing landscape of police involvement in these situations, this is a vulnerable population already. They might be experiencing labor exploitation or trafficking. And then they have the added threat if the trafficker was planning on threatening them with deportation. It's a lot easier to do so now, unfortunately. So that's a great place to focus your advocacy. Okay, I see some members in the chat. Yes, he was one of my favorite authors. I was very angry to hear this. Yeah, I think that unfortunately power kind of begets power, right? So if someone has fame and power and that's really positive, eventually sometimes people are going to misuse that. And then another element of labor trafficking that was defined that I feel like is very relevant to Indiana. We have a lot of state fairs here, right? We have a lot of just random festivals that pop up. We're the Midwest. And so folks that come here on work visas and work carnivals, they are often forced into unsafe working conditions. And because they live where they work, there's that greater threat of like, well, hey, if you don't work for no pay, I'm going to kick you out. You don't speak English and you're not going to be able to get, an apartment. So that threat is quite heavy and can make people feel that they have to work in these unsafe working conditions. Used to be a nanny in Chicago. And that was one area where I would meet people, not understand how their situations were legal. Now that I'm older, I realize that it probably was not. Yeah, thank you, Mallory. I think seeing things that are like, oh, that's weird, that can kind of be a tip off that maybe there's something going on that shouldn't be. And yeah, especially in that domestic work, it can be, yeah, really easy to kind of hide in plain sight. Okay. And then this is an example of like how labor exploitation can turn into labor trafficking. Some bosses and owners who are operating unethically, can delay checks or withhold pay, not give access to meal breaks, and not have like access to safe water. Those things aren't technically like meeting the definition of trafficking. We have to have that force, fraud, and coercion to get to trafficking. So the elements in blue, being actually using violence, intimidation, threatening the law, actually withholding legal documents. Those are examples of how, working under that condition could be trafficking. So this is just a focus on Indiana law briefly. Juvenile prostitution, not a thing. Indiana did not change their language until 2017 to like, you know, a sex trafficking survivor. So glad they changed it, but we're a little late to the law there. But, minors can't be arrested for prostitution. So if you have a family where a minor has been arrested for prostitution, that is a time to engage legal advocacy immediately because that shouldn't happen. Again, minors that are trafficked for any type of commercial sex are engaging, even if they say, like, hey, I posted these photos on my own, right? Or I decided to work in this club. Like, honestly, no one forced me. I just wanted to do this. They still would, meet the legal definition of being trafficked because we know the teenage brain, the adolescent brain, there is a lot of development. So the decision that, an adult would make with all the information provided, a child might not make, right? And so, or they might make a different choice that makes them vulnerable. So the law does recognize that vulnerability. Yeah, we can't say that a minor consented to that. It's still illegal. So if someone is purchasing commercial sex or receiving it, they are still committing this crime under the law. And then for labor trafficking, just matches the federal definition. It's considered a level 4 felony. An important piece here is transporting. So for a lot of our agricultural workers, I actually saw this when I was traveling recently, not trafficking specifically, but there will be like a van. So a lot of folks aren't going to buy a car. So they're here for 4 months, during harvest time. A van will be provided and they will provide transportation to the grocery store. And so I saw like 15 individuals with their carts full just waiting outside. And then like a van came and they all got in. So I was like, okay, yeah, those are probably migrant workers. If the owner of the farm is trafficking those folks, the person driving, even if they don't really know what's going on, but they have a sense, like they could be charged, right? So anybody kind of touching this crime, even if they say, well, I didn't really know, they're at risk for prosecution. So these things are good to know. I think you went over victims' rights this week. So these are the rights in addition to typical survivors' rights. So these are specific to survivors of trafficking. As we mentioned, they're not meant to be jailed or fined. Being provided protection, I think that one really requires some negotiation with your local law enforcement because the law isn't super clear about what protection means. So maybe you could coordinate, to get those free like lock changes. You could use discretionary funds for like a security system, that kind of thing. But also if the situation is serious enough, you can petition for a 24-hour watch, after they've left the situation. And legally, like that could be recommended. Um and then the last bullet point is about some forms that apply to foreign born survivors. Immigration attorneys have a lot on their hands right now, but I think, there's a program at Indiana Legal Services that we'll talk about that's really um, adept and takes a lot of these cases specifically for survivors. So these are good to know about if you're going to be a legal advocate or if you have a legal advocate in your organization. These statutes are still like active, so you don't have to memorize this. If you're not doing legal advocacy, this isn't something that you'll need to keep super top of mind, but just knowing that survivors in Indiana do have rights. Restitution's a tricky one. My former supervisor is a lawyer. And so I was like, what does this word mean? I don't understand. This is compensation from the court. So if someone takes their trafficker to court and actually wins, not super common. So huge win if that does happen. They're entitled to financial compensation. And sometimes the court doesn't order that because this is still something that's, if it's so rare that sometimes judges are like, wait, what do I do? And that's not an offense on judges. It's so rare to get these cases moved through that sometimes it doesn't happen. So they are entitled to compensation. Unfortunately, it's like dependent on, does the trafficker have money or, property that can be turned over? And sometimes it takes a very long time, but they're entitled to it. And it will bring them, that more financial security that just often is not there after a trafficking experience. Okay. So that is our overview of trafficking, the crime, some examples of it. So we're going to go into comparing and contrasting now. So I've stacked the definitions here because we have a lot of similarities, but also some key differences. So starting from the bottom, sexual violence, to broad definition, if someone is forcing or manipulating someone else into unwanted sexual activity without their consent. A similarity to domestic violence. There's power and control elements. It's often not consensual, right? That someone is using power and control over their intimate partner. And it's a pattern of behavior that's often key. So unfortunately, if there's a one-time incident of violence between two partners, it's really complicated and really sad. But if both parties are like, okay, let's make sure this never happens again, not necessarily like reaching that pattern, right? And then in sexual violence and domestic violence, we have force, we have coercion. So that is an overlap there. So to focus in on domestic violence and trafficking, similarities is that this is traumatic. This is really overwhelming for a survivor, and they may often blame themselves for experiencing exploitation. There's also the feelings of manipulation, fear, and emotional attachment, which is really complicated and often like leaves folks stuck. And there's a fear of engaging with the criminal legal system, either because they don't want to get in trouble, or maybe they've had negative experiences in the past where that was not like a helpful system for them, or there was misunderstandings. So any type of power and control dynamic, both of these crimes, those are things that we see survivors reporting. The differences between DV and trafficking are that sex buyers are often strangers. So that is very different than, having sex with a trusted partner. And that normalizes the culture of sex buying. It's just sort of like, part of the brain shuts off because this is just a job, right? So if there's emotional distress, that's getting shoved down because that's not going to be tolerated in this. If there's a profit motivation, so the traffickers focus on the money. Domestic violence does not always involve money or profit, so that's a difference. Unfortunately, with human trafficking, specifically sex trafficking, being seen as just prostitution, or a labor trafficking situation being seen as like illegal immigration, that's going to lead to a mistrust of law enforcement, where law enforcement could be extremely helpful in getting folks connected to prosecutors. Um, you know, when things are moving in the correct way, like victims can get that justice. But because there's been this history of criminalization, and there's just not that trust, and not necessarily in this at the same level as a domestic violence survivor. And then, the field of DV and sexual violence prevention, those are pretty, I won't say old fields, but they're well established. They have well established service standards, and we know what to do, especially with trainings like this. We have a lot of support wrapping around us. There are fewer standards for working with survivors of trafficking. So that can create some muddiness and some disagreement between service organizations. However, there are increasing service standards for survivors and things starting to be streamlined, like on state and national levels. So that's really exciting to see. Protocol is getting established. I see in the chat. The people that kept me were friends with the police chief, so I never thought going to the police was ever an option. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's really vulnerable. And yeah, unfortunately, again, right, if like there's that power dynamic or that hierarchy, it can be misused. No, you're not dragging down the chat at all. That is an extremely valuable comment. And I really appreciate you being here. And it's really important when survivors are advocates, right? Because you have that lived experience and you can empathize with your clients. So thank you so much for sharing. So another similarity that we have is complex PTSD. So, within the mental health field where I've existed, I think it's been really positive that we've started to recognize complex or chronic PTSD. If you think about like a car accident or a one time situation, like a natural disaster, folks who survive those experiences, like they're probably going to avoid situations. They're going to be more hyper vigilant. They might change the way they see the world. But we do see some of those one time events. Folks tend to not carry that trauma as long. They can, but it's not a like strong guarantee. When someone's had chronic exposure to traumatic experiences, it really starts to change different elements of their life in a real way. So emotional dysregulation, really not understanding who they are anymore, um, having some dissociation or like more intense flashbacks, and then just really changes their relationship to others and their relationship to their body. So understanding that there's going to be needs in each of these domains is really important. And then this slide is a very valuable slide in this presentation because it was updated due to an advocate that I was presenting to. So the first time I did this presentation, I had the word trauma bonding on this slide. And I was working with Prevail, shout out to Prevail. And one of the folks in the audience, for lack of a better term, online, I'm like, what do I call you all? Attendees said, have you heard the term trauma coerced attachment? So they just went to this training and they talked about it. And I was like, I'm looking that up as soon as we're done. And I'm really glad that I did because it expands things to really put the onus back on the person exploiting. It is not a weakness, lack of agency, or existing vulnerability in the victim. Trauma coerced attachment is a response to a terrifying event, and it's not a dysfunctional attachment. So we are responding for survival at that point, right? And yeah, so thank you so much, advocates. You have so much to give. And I really hope that that like drives you in your work. So this is survival, trauma coerced attachment. When someone says that they love the person that's hurting them, that's not showing that there's something wrong with them. And that's sort of what this definition shows. So because there's been repeated exposure to abuse and trauma and unpredictable behavior, the person doesn't get to think about themselves, their feelings, their behaviors. They are locked in on that person with the power and the control. They're like, I'm going to focus on you. I'm going to get on your good side. You do that enough times, you're minimizing their bad behavior because you have to feel that you're creating or making the positive behavior happen. So this is important to note because like we're not going to convince a survivor right away. If some of you have been in this work for a minute, you know that, right? Like survivors are going to have relationships with people who are harmful. And hopefully, this can kind of give some more insight into why. So, the big question now that we've talked about it, talking about examples of specific examples, it is important to recognize vulnerable populations. So, while anyone can be a survivor, um, these are some populations that are more vulnerable to it and to tend to have higher rates of experiencing trafficking. So starting from top left, we have folks with with invisible disabilities also. That's kind of what like 2 and 3 or figure 2 represents. So if someone feels that their movement is limited or they don't fully comprehend what is occurring, that makes them vulnerable. Figure 2 represents mental health, but also childhood sexual abuse. So experiencing childhood sexual abuse is a risk factor for later victimization. Figures 3 and 4 really go together because runaway youth, increasingly, we're seeing that they do identify as queer, gay, transgender. And so not having the social supports that are necessary for us all to thrive and running away from home, that makes them at risk. Someone can say, oh, I have a place to stay. And then they are like, yes, awesome, a roof. And that creates an environment where that person can take advantage of them. Figure 5, illustrating domestic violence, either being the adult in that situation or being the child in that situation. Figure 6, experiencing homelessness. This photo was actually taken in Indianapolis. Some of you may recognize that skyline. Figure 7, showing substance addiction and how that changes the effects on the brain, that changes what activities and environments that folks are in. So again, that substance use facilitated trafficking, using that as a means of control. And then figure 8, recognizing our immigrant population and folks that are, coming from, they're in an entirely new environment. They don't understand their rights. So that's the biggest thing. Making sure that we have connections with culturally specific organizations because we understand that there's that vulnerability there. Um, and just paying special attention to our immigrant survivors at this time. So here's kind of a broad overview. I think that the important fact here is that you have to have context and proximity in order to be able to identify a survivor. So as an advocate, like when you initially are meeting with a survivor, you may not understand what's happening. At the conference that I was recently at, they were talking about how it took like 3 months to identify the person's like key concerns as trafficking. So the people in their life are going to have a better understanding. If survivors are willing to involve trusted folks in their life, those people in their care and in their recovery, those people may have a better understanding of what's going on. So like don't put pressure on yourself to say, okay, what kind of violence is this? Like we're helping survivors. And if they're willing to share their story over time, we can have a better sense. So here's just like some overview. I'll kind of highlight some examples within like the physical. So we had a survivor that kind of came through our screening process. They did not end up qualifying for our program, but their medical history included multiple STIs, multiple injuries, head injuries included, and substance use. So a lot of the elements here, like that is one of the survivors that was referred to our program. So just keeping in mind as things cluster together. For example, a burn in various stages of healing. You could have burned yourself on the stove, right? So one thing does not a crime make, but as you see things cluster, like that's when we can start to kind of have more questions and more awareness there. With the behavioral, I think it's important to note like if someone's walls are completely up, we know that, perhaps there's been trauma there. The key factors here for possible trafficking would be if they do have a history of voluntarily engaging in commercial sex, that could be a key that they're vulnerable. And then if you have these additional layers like being fearful and submissive, not having control of identity documents, that could be a clue. And then for social and relational, especially a lot of our folks who have serious mental illness illness or substance use concerns, if they say they're being like harassed at work, or if like a minor recently got a job and they're like staying with friends coming out of homelessness, again, those things in isolation could be, unfortunate, but not immediately a problem. Really understanding like what kinds of relationships do they have? Do they have no relationships? And then they talk about kind of depending on this one person a lot. Those are some vulnerabilities there. So I like to share this. I've had folks say that they've like printed this out and put this in like orientation materials. They have a binder of like educational materials. So some of you may be familiar with like the domestic violence power and control wheel. The Duluth Project did create a human trafficking power and control wheel. So everything that we talked about, these examples, a lot of them are outlined in this wheel. So you don't have to remember everything. It's really resourcing, helping your staff understand these key signs. And so this is a really like quick visual reference that can be used. So thinking about barriers and how we as advocates can address barriers. We've discussed quite a few of these, but I think what I'd like to highlight here is believing that they have a real debt to pay and taking this seriously. So thinking that like no one can help them get out of this. Like you just don't understand my situation, right? Like this person says I owe them 20 grand. Like I have to do whatever they say, right? I'm trying to live my life. I can't, have this hanging over my head. Again, a barrier is like trusting someone who lied to them and holding out hope that it will improve. Again, with that trauma coerced attachment, like if they're really locked into that relationship at this moment for survival, then that's going to make like identifying them and engaging them difficult. And then again, like threats to family members, they're not going to want to engage with you in advocacy for fear, like maybe they'll find out, right? They'll find out I'm coming to this program and they'll see that as like me trying to leave, right? And then definitely highlighting gender bias. It really depends on the environment, but for a lot of male survivors, they're not going to think that they can access care because, it's a women's shelter or it's a domestic violence shelter. Men are not want to identify that way. Gender norms of masculinity and not, I could never be hurt like that, right? And then especially our transgender males and transgender female folks, non-binary folks, if an agency is not explicitly affirming of all sexualities and gender expressions, like they're not really going to want to turn there, right? Everyone has to feel safe in order to get care. Okay, so the question remains like, what are we going to do about this, right? The Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, I felt like this question was just perfect. I was like, we don't need to change this. This is a great example. Like, how are we going to integrate the needs of our trafficked survivors? We have a range of victimizations and use our current frameworks to do that, right? We have all these programs. How do we use them and not reinvent the wheel? So, survivor centered work includes wellness, right? A survivor is a human being. And so, what do human beings need? I think it's really key to point out here that being intentional about what the survivor wants and letting them lead their journey to wellness. So, like, you might think you need to move out immediately, right? Like, you're ready to disengage from this situation. We're going to help you do that, but you can't live there. They might be like, listen, you don't have a shelter space. I'd be homeless. Right now, I'm just going to save up money. Like, I'm just going to go work at this place where like person trafficking them is cool with them working, often like, not easy, but being able to help them build like that financial wealth, or they just really want to go to church. Like they need that spiritual fulfillment. And you're saying like, no, you need this to be well. We have to let them lead. We have to let them engage in the wellness that they need at that time. Because if we let them lead, that is healing. And that is also developing more of that trust that we're there to support them. We're not there to like tell them what to do. I know the name of our agency sometimes makes men think that they cannot come to us. What is the name of your agency, Shannon?
We're the Center for Women and Families.
I thought so. Yes. So families, right? That could be interpreted as, anyone. But when you start with Center for Women, yeah, it can definitely be difficult. And it's a lot of work to rebrand. Like I watched an agency and like Firefly had to rebrand for an entire year because it was two companies merging into one. So, if that's something that your agency wants to embark on, I that could be useful. But yeah, I think a lot of times it's about like keeping that at top of mind of what communities might you not be able to reach, and then either having really good referral sources or like creating some of that access and marketing materials as like having your agency do that. Creating a shared vocabulary, really key. So, I run into this sometimes when I'm working with folks who do not want to hear the term like domestic violence, or like on the opposite end, they're like, no, I was not sexually assaulted. Like I was raped, right? Like they want to clarify exactly what happened to them. If some of the language that they're using is really challenging for you to engage with, it's understandable. Some words are really triggering for us. Some words are just seem like too harsh for the experience or not harsh enough. Like just match their language, right? If you don't feel comfortable to say it, you can use something vague like harm or like the experience, the situation, but it is important to let the survivor self identify. And then if you feel comfortable to match their language, as long as it's not like, really demoralizing them, that's a learning opportunity to be like, well, why are you calling yourself that? But other than that, really trying to like let them lead in the language. And then these are really relevant, these are specific to you all and like how can you meet needs of survivors. So consistently obtaining training beyond today, beyond, other things that you may have heard, just keeping up with the agencies that are producing content and like are on the front lines of working with survivors on like state and national levels, and then collaborating with external providers. That was my favorite thing to do when I worked at ICASA was meeting folks who worked at rape crisis centers or like sexual assault response teams and being able to provide context for anti-trafficking work. You don't need to hold that in your brain. You're already doing a lot. Being able to know like I'm going to hold this much in my brain. I'm going to learn this much, but it's going to take time for me to really understand. And so when I encounter a situation, I can ask for help. So building those relationships with other providers and then knowing your limitations, like that's okay to have those, right? Having good partnerships. And then, as we mentioned, under the client's autonomy, understand why they may be in the situation they're in, um, and promoting their ability to meet their own needs. Like, that is everything. I've seen that so important in work with folks with serious mental illness, a lot of stigma for survivors. And so being like, what do you want to do? Maybe they've never been asked that, you know? And so that's really key as well. So, meeting a survivor's needs starts with meeting your own. I have definitely had my fair share of ups and downs in this work because it's really difficult. And so, here are a few resources that I would recommend. The book Burnout: The Secret to Unlocking the Stress Cycle by Emily and Amelia Nagoski was like truly a game changer for me. Everything that they were saying about burnout, like I was identifying with. And of course, this was when my daughter was 6 months old. So, like, yeah, that's a perfect recipe for burnout. But being able to do things that help stress move through your body, help stress release, and having consistent self-care practices in what I mean by that truly is like drinking water, eating well, moving. Like that is self-care. And then you can move, that should be number one, and then move from that to like relaxation practices and yoga and like social support. But like if your physical body is not getting what it needs, like listen, I've been dehydrated on a busy work day, so let's not let's not create those environments. Let's make sure our body also has what it needs. And then thinking about like trauma stewardship, being able to care for your own experiences of trauma and then also that of others. Like those things need to happen together or have happened. We're all doing the best that we can, right? And so hopefully these resources can be of use to you in that process. And then for like system access, really trying to make it low barrier, right? So for our survivors, like some programs say, you have to be sober to be here. Can we take a better harm reduction lens and say, like, if you aren't high when you're here, or like, if you are involved in recovery services, then you can stay, right? And then if someone is, asked to leave the program or drops out of the program, can they always come back? That's really going to be key for survivors of trafficking, knowing that they have like a safe space to land. And then my second recommendation, again from the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender Based Violence, is having advocates who are trained and have identified skill sets. So, kind of the way that I interpret this is like, yes, have the same skill sets, have the same training, go to this core 40, right? Continue to learn beyond that, but understand your strengths as well. Like where I work, we host groups for like creative writing and art and, understanding your symptoms, like those kinds of things. And when I was working with the rape crisis centers, like similarly, right? Like some agencies host different groups based on like the life experience of the advocate, Was somebody a yoga instructor? Is somebody really skilled at teaching like communication skills, right? So just like feel confident to bring those ideas to the table because creativity is a really big healer, especially when it comes to trauma. Shannon, do you have something?
Yeah. So I'm actually building my groups right now that I'll eventually lead. And being my experience, I'm a big reader and I'm an artist. So I'm focusing my groups on bringing trauma care in through things that I enjoy doing.
Yeah, that is perfect because like that brings your humanity in as well, right? It's a really important modeling of like we are not just our trauma, right? Like so if they see you living into your hobbies and interests, they feel like they can do that or they learn something new that they connect with. Like that is so awesome. Good for you. And then thinking through like what's the trauma informed care? Do all of your volunteers up to your leadership have the same understanding of what trauma informed care is? Volunteers are so excited. They mean so well, but they may come from a life experience or a lens where they're the helper. They're here to fix it. Not going to be super trauma informed for a lot of our survivors. So just making sure that everybody is on the same page. And then language access and advocacy for foreign born survivors. As I've said many times, regardless of what's going on in state and federal government, like that's always helpful for someone to be able to communicate in their own language. Based on your funding source, you may be required to provide language access. So having good access to interpretation services, and also understanding like who are the legal resources in your community or who could you refer them to should they have a legal concern. But being able to speak in your own language, like that's so key. I studied Spanish for 5 years and I still can't say it very well. I can read it. I can't say it very well, So imagine not really having much exposure at all. So this is just kind of the last steps of due diligence. So we've identified a survivor, we are giving them resources. Now we're kind of stepping into that last piece of what are the other resources? What are our responsibilities in addition to helping them in our agency? So it's a child is being if you suspect a child's being abused or neglected, then we need to report to DCS always. But if you believe that there might be trafficking, it's important when you call the DCS hotline to say, I suspect human trafficking. I worked pretty closely with the human trafficking division of DCS when I was at ICASA, and those folks are amazing. They are so committed. At first, it was just one person, and then she got a whole team. And I was like, yes, I'm so happy. And so saying I suspect human trafficking flags that case to be referred to that team. So that's just really key to help streamline that process so they don't kind of get lost in the shuffle. All right, I think I saw a chat. Some jobs are restricting people to speak their language. Okay, so you mean like when they go to work, they have to speak the language of like the workplace? Like they have to speak English or what do you mean by that? Must speak English. Yeah. That's a bummer for sure. Some private businesses like they do get to make those rules. I'm not again, not a lawyer, a therapist, but yeah, I think making sure that language access is available in our settings like and then troubleshooting that, like thinking about like can we get you into a local English class, right? Again, probably not top of mind, but maybe it is top of mind. Maybe that's going to be key for them to be able to work independently. So, as difficult as that is, if we can't change the policy, we can support. the survivor in that. Yeah, but thank you for sharing that. I didn't know that. And then for adult survivors, it's not mandatory to report if you suspect human trafficking. But if you do report or you give them information to report their situation, it can streamline access to resources. So they could call the hotline. The National Human Trafficking Hotline has just changed hands. So I don't know if this number will stay the same. Like this just recently happened like a couple weeks ago. So just keep up to date, see if the number changes, Google it. It's a little bit of a mess right now, but their website is still active and the number is still active. So yeah, just keep a hold of that. And I would imagine if you like call the number and the number has changed, they'll probably set it up to tell you like, hey, this business now uses this number. So yeah, hoping for the best there, but um there's a lot of good resources on the website as well. And then in some cases, if someone is experiencing neglect or exploitation and they are an endangered adult, so that would be, typically it's older adults with dementia, but it could also be someone who is really disoriented or disorganized, has a serious mental illness. If they have been harmed, you can call Adult Protective Services. They do not necessarily have the same streamlined operations as DCS. A lot of them operate kind of independently based on their community. May not have like all the inclusive things you need, but can provide more information about a survivor's rights. But yeah, they have to be an endangered adult. So if you have questions about that or want to learn more about that, you can go on the website. And then my favorite folks, people that I worked with that I love to continue to support our local and national resources. So, local resources, we have Indiana Legal Services. They have a workers' rights and protection project. So, they provide legal advocacy to survivors free of charge, depending on their income. If they do have access to, a lot of finances, which is not common, but it is income based. So, it will be provided for free, which is really exciting. Another resource for 18 to 24, or not 18 to 24, high risk youth up to 24 years old is the Indiana Trafficking Victims Assistance Program. They help to operate regional coalitions around the state. And then they also contract with providers to be able to provide they provide oversight and make sure that like the contracted service providers are trained to work with trafficked youth, and then they will help to facilitate that care, whether it's for free or, making sure that they have continued access to that care. If you have an adult and you're just spinning your wheels, you don't know any resources, you can't find any resources, you can still ask them. And they may know about referral options for adults, but they work with youth up to 24. And there is an address confidentiality program through the Indiana Attorney General's office. So a victim advocate would work with the survivor to complete the application, and that gets filed. And then that will eliminate like that person's name associated with their address. Like their address cannot be identified through several means. So that can be really helpful if someone has gained independence and is, needing to not to be accessed, right? And it's for safety as well. And some federal resources there. Like I said, the National Human Trafficking Hotline has a really great website, and you can search for programs very specifically with search terms like gender, age, accessibility needs. And then there are some credit repair options as well. So many times with the finances being abused, a trafficker is like, okay, this credit card's in your name, but all this money is mine now, right? So being able to document this did happen in the context of, me being a survivor and going through this exploitation process, you can submit to the credit bureaus to have that scrubbed. So that's really nice. And then some human trafficking specific service providers in Indianapolis. There's Grit into Grace. They have a drop in center and work with commercially sexually exploited individuals. They offer services to women and transgender women. And they do a lot of advocacy, case management. The last that I spoke with them, they were still facilitating support groups and education groups in Indiana Women's Prison, as well as, I believe, the local Marion County Jail as well. So they're just really doing a lot of great prevention advocacy. Love them. They are survivor led. So that's really wonderful to have that perspective. There's also Unconditional. So that's outreach, resources, and support for women exiting adult entertainment or the sex industry. And they provide transitional housing. really, really big and important need. Sent 121 specializes in counseling for trafficked youth under 18s. They provide community based and residential care, support groups. I live like 3 minutes from their office now, which is so great. They have a wonderful facility, a big kitchen, like beanbag chairs. It seems like a really great, like safe space for youth. So that was really great to get to see that, and they also facilitate a lot of training. So if you are a mental health provider or you have mental health providers in your community that need that additional anti-trafficking education, that 121, they are your ladies. Okay. And those are my references. So if you're a research nerd like me, you can read into that. Uh, and then this is my contact information. I respond to email throughout the week, not as much. You can text me. That's probably the easiest way to get a hold of me. I'm not working actively in this field right now, so it may like take me a minute to answer your question about resources. Um, but I would be happy to facilitate that and help with that. And also, can kind of provide like additional discussion and support in that way. So, yeah, happy to be contacted. Text is easiest, email is also just fine. So, thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Marissa, for joining us today. If there are any other questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat. Otherwise, if any questions come up afterwards, we will direct those over to Marissa for getting answered. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you joining us today.
Absolutely. Take care, everybody. Enjoy your last day. And I know you're all going to do great work.